University of Gothenburg. And there pretty much I teach artists how to become artistic researchers, in short. Before starting my PhD, I did an MA in gender and sexuality studies. And before that, I did a BA in history of art and aesthetics. So this kind of non-linear pathway as to how I ended up doing a PhD in an architecture school, having never studied architecture, is a large part of the reason why I position myself as a transdisciplinary scholar. So why transdisciplinary as opposed to interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary? And I align with the thinking of global studies scholars, Eve Darian-Smith and Philip McCarthy, because they argue that transdisciplinarity offers us a more flexible and pluralized understanding of knowledge, because within that framework, disciplines, and they're referring to 3 or more, merge to form a decentralized mass where there are no disciplinary centers. So individual disciplines cannot be distinguished from each other, and there is no value system. And for me, this contrasts a multidisciplinary structure, which kind of rests on the idea of stable disciplinary wholes remaining intact and uninfluenced when they interact. And similarly, I think it contrasts an interdisciplinary approach, which often kind of is situated within a binary framing of only 2 disciplines merging. So I'm very much interested in what can be produced when unlikely disciplinary combinations generate a space of coexistence. How can our thinking and practices be challenged, expanded, and nuanced? So in my PhD research, I brought together the disciplines and fields of architecture, Japanese studies, art, history, sociology, urban studies, anthropology, philosophy, and gender studies to form a pluralized mass of knowledge where no knowledge framework establishes a hierarchy over another. And as part of this transdisciplinary endeavor, I really wanted to challenge the assumption that social science theory more generally and architectural theory more specifically is expressed through the realm of the textual by mobilizing artistic practice. And it's this which I'm going to partially show today. So I think it makes sense by very briefly, and this is very brief, introducing the contextual focus of my PhD. The research looks at the cultural, social, spatial, and urban existences of a certain type of housing model, which started to take form as an architectural phenomenon in Japan in the 1990s, shortly after the burst of the bubble economy, which was in 1991. So the model is frequently referred to as Kyosho Jutaku by Japanese architects. And at the top of the slide, you can see the distinction. The first 2 characters are combined to form the word Kyosho. And the first character means narrow, and the second means little or small. And then the second word, Jutaku, is made up of 2 characters, the first meaning to live or to dwell, and the second meaning house or home. So these small houses first emerged in Tokyo as a practical solution for the burst of the economy and the lack of job opportunities that were available, and people kind of were looking to retain their pre-bubble lifestyles. And typically they could really only afford to do that by buying plots of land, which were typically the size of a large car parking space. So, sorry, I have notes and they're disappearing all over the place. I apologize. Okay, yeah, so in order to kind of activate these small micro plots of land, architects really began developing a previous prototype of a low interest lone small house, which was originally developed in the 1950s. as a response to the housing shortage which came after the Second World War. So they used the Kyosho-Ryukyuku model not only to establish their portfolios and studios, but also to test out new forms of spatial boundaries, which challenged imported ideas of domesticity, of public and private distinctions, and of familial structure, which was introduced into Japan through the American occupation in the 1950s. So there's quite a lot of disparity among architects as to what the criteria is for a house to be considered Kyosho-Ryukyuku. But generally, there's an agreement that the house must be detached. It must be on a plot of a maximum of 100 square meters. And because of very strict Japanese building regulations, this means that the built area is less than half of that amount. And it must also have design input from an architect. To give a bit of perspective, Kyosho-Ryukyuku make up about 6% of housing in Tokyo. So this is just an estimate because there isn't any statistical data on them. So as you can see, it's not a widespread model. If you're in Tokyo, you likely won't come across them frequently, if at all. But they do play a role, however minute, in the ecology of urban life. It's also maybe worth understanding that housing in Japan works quite differently to other global contexts, in that there's practically no secondhand housing market. This is starting to change a little bit because of sustainability measures and the population decline. But it basically means that up until now, roughly every 26 to 30 years, houses have been consistently knocked down and rebuilt. And this has established what's considered to be an architectural generational system. So there are considered to be 4 generations of houses. The first generation beginning in 1923, the second in 1949, the third in 1975, and the current 4th generation in 2001. And architects are kind of considered to fit within those generational distinctions. So at this point, you're thinking, you know, how did I research this? What was my motivation? Which is a good question. I spent some time in Japan in 2013. And during that time, I happened to stumble across the Kyosho-Ryukyuku house, which was a street away from where I was staying. And I would go by and walk past the house almost every evening during my stay. And during those brief moments of everyday interaction, I began to build a relationship with it just by witnessing its existence. And this witnessing set me off on a path of researching, which was just for fun at this point, the historical trajectory and contemporary use of the Kyosho-Ryukyuku model. As I was reading both Anglophone and Japanese text, I started to notice how these houses were being represented and framed and understood in Japan, which was very different to how they were being understood and circulated in a European and North American context. So in Anglophone cultural commentary, they're typically represented as symbols of weird and wonderful Japan. There's often a complete lack of knowledge around Japanese history and culture. There are a lot of stereotypes circulating in these articles, things like Japanese people are so inherently minimalist and this is why they can live in these tiny houses, etc. These are just some of the popular media headlines you can get from just a simple Google search. And inbuilt into these articles is a lot of Orientalist rhetoric. And by that, I mean an exoticization of Japanese people and identity. So one example of this is an article written for the British newspaper, the Financial Times, by architectural critic Edwin Heathcote, who called Kyosho-Ryukyuku a mouth-watering and magical architectural feast of the sublime. And this uses linguistic devices which removes these houses from the realm of normality and others them by suggesting that they are kind of only in existence to entertain awe-inspired Europeans who are out to consume them. So this way of writing is really not dissimilar from when Europeans would go on tours of Japan in the 19th century, and they would come back and write about objects that they would acquire, like byobu, which are folding screens, or ukiyo-e, which are wood block prints, and katsu, which are objects from samurai culture. Now, unsurprisingly, in Japanese writing, the houses are framed very practically. as space-saving solutions for urban living and as part of a creative lifestyle choice. So typically the focus is not really on the aesthetics of the design, but on its functionality. And these images are editions of popular lifestyle magazines, which published ultimate reference guides to urban small house living, where they discuss how to live kachikoku or wisely within the model, offering tips on loans, on micro gardening advice, as well as a full directory of architects who are currently designing them. So the focus of this discourse is very much on the activity which takes place within the structures themselves and the lifestyles that they can offer Tokyoites, as opposed to a strong focus on object design, as found in Anglophone commentary. So because of this kind of great disparity in representation, I was quite driven to produce some Anglophone research on the topic, which would center the voices of Japanese people. And in doing so, kind of counter these problematic narratives, not only of the houses themselves, but of Japanese identity. So I intentionally chose to focus my research on the fourth generation of Kyoto Jutku and architects, largely because very little is written about them in English, despite the fact that they're the ones currently reconceptualizing the Kyoto Jutku and taking it in a very different direction. And I think the reason for this is because the majority of them don't have an international presence. So all information about them is written in Japanese only. And that's not good for lazy journalists, essentially. So as a result of this, nearly all Anglophone writing on this topic really focuses on the third generation, specifically on houses built in the late 90s and the early 2000s by well-known architects like Shigeru Ban and Yasuko Yoshishima, for example. So in my research, I wanted to generate a situational reading of the model, something which had not been previously done in Japanese or in English, by focusing on the everyday, by generating slow architectural research as a way of showing that these houses are not static and isolated design objects, but rather network containers of a diverse urban life. And I also wanted to interrogate this foreign-produced ideas that these houses are symbols of a Japanese architectural identity, something architect Arata Isozaki termed Nihon Teki, or Japanness. So I wanted to speak to architects and owners about their views on this, specifically whether they think Japanness exists or not. And I saw my role in the research as taking responsibility for these problematic Anglophone narratives by working to produce a counter position, a position that's not motivated or interested in looking at my own opinion on these houses and what they might represent to me, but rather how Japanese people understand and engage them and the meanings that they produce for them within the context of Tokyo. And it's important to say that having research or commentary conducted in English does hold meaning for many Japanese architects because it allows their work to circulate in international spheres more readily. And because of that, the research had the capacity to work for the people it was centering. And that was a very important ethical position for me to take in terms of the insider-outsider relationship. So I'm going to briefly show today a small portion of the creative practice work which I made. To begin introducing this work, it's first necessary to go back to this idea of Japanness or Nihon Teki that I wanted through this research project to interrogate the contemporary understanding of. So the term was first coined by Arata Isozaki in the late 1990s in an essay he wrote titled Nihon Teki na Mono, which was later published in 2003 in a book titled Kenjiku ni Kokoro Nihon Teki na Mono, or in English, Japanness in Architecture. Japanness is a very specific term and is not to be confused with Japaneseness or Nihonjinron, which has quite a a longer history of scholarly and popular debate, which is centered on nationalism. So rather, Japanness refers to the ways in which foreigners or non-Japanese people interpret Japanese architecture to represent a visual and conceptual Japanese identity. So, for example, you might look at this image of Nakagin Capsule Tower, which was built in 1970, a building that's widely considered to be an emblem of Japanese, the architectural movement and metabolism, and consider this to be an aesthetic and spatial construction particular to Japan. The forming of this consideration means that one places a Japanese architectural identity onto that structure, and we might not be able to identify why we think or feel this way about it. So while Isozaki deems any origins of Japanness kind of inconclusive, he does suggest that the term was conceptually created in line with modernity, a starting point which I think is undoubtedly intertwined with the birth of architecture as a named discipline and profession within Japan. So the mid-19th century trend, which I mentioned earlier, where European tourists visited Japan in order to locate and promote a certain image of Japanese identity, returning with these objects that they deemed to be authentically Japanese. This history really provided the foundation for modernist architects in the 1930s to repeat this process. But instead of objects, they returned home with concepts such as simplicity, humility, purity, lightness, which they later implemented into their designs, a well-known example being German architect Bruno Taut. So for Isozaki, Japanness intensifies and dulls at certain periods of time. So for example, he cites the 1950s and the American occupation as a time of intensity, and the 1990s, which was the post-bubble era, as a time of decomposure. So Japanness is therefore not a concept tied to a specific time or space, but one which travels and flows between past, present, and future. And because of this, I would argue that it emulates how Latin American scholars such as Ramon Grasfogel or Walter Mignolo, for example, have framed coloniality. Whereas colonialism is a historical period of time which marks colonial rule, coloniality is a historically repeated process whereby colonial power continuously morphs into different entities in relation to contemporary contexts. So despite the fact that Isozaki speaks of these moments of intensity and decomposure, he also contradicts himself in the text because he argues that the current generation of Japanese architects, which was when he wrote it, was the third generation, no longer have to engage with Japanness because modernity has now come and gone. And I wanted through my research to kind of challenge this dismissal and assess how the now current fourth generation conceived Japanness and whether, in line with its kind of flexible foundations, it has transformed in potentially new ways. Particularly, I was interested in how the fourth generation conceived Japanness in relation to the Kyosho Dutoku, particularly whether they felt that the Kyosho Dutoku model had become a contemporary signifier or symbol of Japanness. I was also interested in what would be produced when I, as a foreign outsider, actively rejected the notion that Japanness can only be produced by outsiders. And this was something Isozaki was very clear on. So what would happen when I sought to move Japanness from the outside and situate it within the inside? What would happen to the theory if a Japanese architect was seen to be instrumental in producing Japanness? So i.e., if Japanese architects were not passively having an identity placed on their work, but rather they were actively informing those foreign understandings. So to begin this process, I asked these two interconnected questions to a series of fourth generation architects. How do you think Kyosho-jutsu are perceived outside of Japan? And what is your opinion of Japanness, and how do you define it? Now, in Japan, it's customary, if you're going to interview someone, to send your questions by email or fax, yes, fax, in advance. This is a process which works to reinforce kind of the formality of business interaction. So when I sent these questions in advance, I received 5 instances where the architects replied by email before the interviews in order to ask the question in reference to question 2, how would you like me to define it? And this told me straight away that there's perhaps a pervasive belief, as perpetuated by Isozaki, that the foreigner is the one who understands Japanness, while the Japanese architect merely engages Japanness through the self, and therefore they cannot identify it. Another interesting point was that all of the architects I spoke to considered these to be very different questions with no correlation. But halfway through the interview, or sometimes at the end, they were often quite surprised how they had used their answer to the first question to reinforce the second. And I received very different answers, and I don't have time to go into all of them, but 2 things reoccurred, which proved quite critical to my thinking. And the first one is perhaps obvious and expected, that there is no such thing as a singular aesthetic of Japan. And 2, that the 4th generation challenge Isozaki's views through the fact that they no longer conceive Japanness to operate aesthetically. So through these object-focused notions of lightness, purity, harmony, etc., but rather through active spatial processes which manifest differently on the local, the national, and the global levels. So this reading of Japanness as active spatial practice instigated me to mobilize creative practice as a way of materializing this theoretical extension. So in other words, I wanted my own engagement with theory to speak to the way in which the 4th generation were they themselves engaging Japanness as an active practice. So I chose to create a series of multimedia material constructions, which directly responded to the ideas, the imaginings, and the understandings of 4th generation Japanness, explicitly reflecting the notion that it is an active spatial practice as opposed to a static aesthetic theory. So to be clear, these material constructions produced from this practice are not my understandings of Japanness. Rather, they speak directly to how the architects articulated Japanness to me in interviews. So each material construction also develops a connection to one or more of the Kyosho-jutsu projects that were included in the research. Importantly, I was trying to emulate a methodology of zooming. I'm not really going to go into the complexities of that today, but I wanted to do that through an act of situating the collective body of work, not so that it draws on the physical design of the houses, but on the components of the public and private network in which these Kyosho-jutsu operate. So while elements of design do influence each construction, they're not essential to their manifestation. Rather, their connections to the urban environment, scale, spatial boundaries, organic matter, and their materiality are the key markers which inform the creative production. So because of that, they aim to move away from representing houses as objects, instead framing them as subjects in process. I want to also say that these material constructions that I made for the PhD are in their first iteration. So I don't see these as final or finished. And in some ways, being in an architecture school rather than somewhere like an art academy where I work now, placed certain limits on them, because institutionally they were framed as kind of secondary to the written thesis. And as a result, I felt like I had less time to develop them than the textual thesis. And at the time, that was something I was a bit frustrated with, but something I've come to realize was actually beneficial, because to me, I'm still thinking of them as unfinished, and they always have the potential to reformulate, and I always have something to come back to, and that's quite useful for me now. So I'm just going to talk about 2 of them in some detail. There are 6 works that were produced. And I'll begin with this photographic series. I made a book out of this series, which is called Gaps or Schema. And it basically explores the gaps which make up Tokyo's urban core as a spatial typology. All of the images in the book were taken in a single day as a way of documenting the diversity which is contained within a specific time period. So they capture a range of locations. They represent both spaces considered public and those considered private, and those which deliberately blur that distinction. So gaps are fundamental to how the city has developed. They're both practical in terms of storage and of light air infiltration, and they're also imaginative, because many of the architects I interviewed emphasize the potential for gaps to be transformative. Architect Kitayama Ko has argued that Tokyo's gaps have the capacity to create new spatial components. And Atelier Bow Wow actually extend this to suggest that the gaps can unite to form a network of urban green space, which I found very interesting as a theory. So there was basically significant suggestion in my interviews that gaps have the capacity to contribute to the revitalization of the city via their ability to generate resistance and sustainable structures. And the gaps themselves arose as a topic of conversation with 4th generation architects in relation to Japanness, because a number of them articulated that Japanness for them is not only about the transformation of microspaces, but also about a deep connection and considerations of how the spatial theory of Ma could operate. So Ma is a space-time theory which considers how in-between emptiness can be infused with a certain energy of possibility. Now that's a really simple definition for the sake of right now, and it's quite a complex notion, but there is quite a bit of literature on the topic, although I wouldn't say anything particularly good in English. So because of this association of gaps with a Japanese architectural identity, I wanted to try find a way to interact with them. So the photographs I took of gaps over a single day served to situate them within the everyday. Because I think without more understanding of how gaps are currently manifesting in the city, and actually a lot of the architects I talked to didn't fully understand how they were being used by everyday people. I think there's little chance that any architectural intervention which seeks to revitalize them is actually possible. So the images present a range of zoomed in and zoomed out perspectives, some zooming into the kind of complex mesh of materials which occupy the gaps, some zooming out to their situated spatial location in the city. And doing this, like mirroring that zooming with the camera, allowed me to get a sense of how the gaps are operating on both micro and macro scales. So gaps are also a critical consideration for Kyosho-Jutsu design. The image that you can see on the left-hand side shows a small old building that was soon due to be knocked down so that a new Kyosho-Jutsu project can take its place. And that house was designed by one of the architects that were involved in my research. So the design is due to be 16 meters squared. So it will occupy a gap, as you can see, but it will also create new gaps. And the plot being the size it is means that it's likely that the gaps will become unofficial parts of the plot. And I would see this a lot in my documentation of some of the houses, that these gap spaces were used, the kind of people's everyday possessions leaked out into those spaces. People had kind of makeshift gardens. There were all different types of uses of that space. So in my documentation of these gaps, I kind of noticed the vast amount of ways that they were being used to accommodate the needs of the city. They were homes for animals. On the image on the right-hand side, that gap there housed a family of frogs, for example. There are also spaces where children play, where people hang laundry, where plant life grows. There are spaces that house air conditioners and ventilation systems. So I see these photographs, and there are actually thousands of them taken over the timescale of a single day, as a way of getting to understand their current role in the city. And they don't really do anything more than that at this first juncture. Something I'm working on at the moment as a way of continuing this construction is to use the images within a digital essay format, so that the gaps can be interactively activated by readers as their cursor moves over the gaps. So this activation would kind of seek to reproduce these everyday occurrences that I was witnessing when I was documenting them, while also providing an academic narrative around the history of gaps within Tokyo. I also made a series of soundscapes as part of the PhD, and I'm hoping to embed those within this digital essay format. But it's, it's quite at an early stage right now. And then the final work that I thought I would briefly show is a 12-minute video work that is titled Kakami. And it was shot in Tokyo over a period of 1 month in 2018. And the video directly responds to a statement that was made by architect Sugawara Daisuke, where he said that Japanness exists in a way that urban architecture is activated to allow nature to reflect back to us. And to explain this, he used the metaphor of the Shinto shrine mirror. Shintoism is a religion in Japan. And there's this mirror called the Yato no Kakami, which is where the title of this video comes from. And it's situated within the Issei Grand Shrine. And this mirror is said to reflect honesty. So an honesty which kind of directs us to confront our realities. So this natural reflection was also seen in the house that Sugawara Daisuke and I conducted our interview in, because as I was talking to him, I started to notice that several round mirrors were positioned at specific points in the house, so that the natural life of this small courtyard garden, which was actually in the center of the house, was reflected onto the mirrors on the inside. And I found that a very interesting spatial choice to have made. So I wanted to engage with that. So the material construction I made shows a mirror placed in conversation with everyday manifestations of nature and urban architecture throughout the city, kind of as a way of drawing attention to their close proximity. Essentially how they occupy the same spatial field. I was also interested in engaging with monumental and ideological understandings of nature. So for example, in this picture, you can see on the right, this idea of cherry blossoms and the idea of Mount Fuji came up a lot in interviews in relation to Japanness. And as I was making this film, I saw that there's a very careful framing here of Tokyo Tower, emboldened in Japan's national colors, although ironically the structure is a literal representation of the Eiffel Tower, but that's a different story. And directly under this, there's a Buddhist temple with a cherry blossom garden. So when you look at the cherry blossoms, Tokyo Tower as a supposed architectural symbol of Japan is reflected back to you. So I chose to use a video because I, again, wanted to explore this methodology of zooming in, zooming out. So I wanted to engage with the movement itself in space. I wanted the viewer of the work to trace that movement in their experience of watching the film. So each shot begins by focusing on what is contained within the mirror, with each following shot zooming out to reveal the mirror's urban situated positioning. The pace of the construction is deliberately very slow. I wanted to try and see if I could generate an energy around the pause of each zoom to see whether it is capable of establishing this Ma-like atmosphere, which I mentioned earlier. I think I will stop there because I have now spoken for almost 14 minutes. And we can move to see if anyone has any questions.
I'm sure everyone's clapping. Such and I'm kind of a bit speechless. There's so much going on. There's so much depth and rigor to what you're talking about, and so many avenues in which to pose a question to you. If anyone does have a question, as usual, please raise your hand electronically, or you can put a Q in the comments box, or alternatively, write your question down in the chat if you'd like one of us to speak on your behalf. But yes, there's just so much content there and very beautifully described. And I think we've gone through this process with you of how you've actually discovered your research topic. And I think probably quite a lot of us fall in that category of idolizing Japanese architecture. So I think the way that you spoke through the articles and how the media and foreigners and how us as outsiders perceive Japanese architecture is wonderful. And I think not only is that something that we can apply to Japanese, but maybe when we start looking at other cultures as well and other architecture from different places, that kind of depth and rigor. So yeah, I guess my first question to you then would be, as students of architecture, we're all here. Many of us may be inspired by Japanese architecture. This is a great starting point or an additional step for many of us. But what could you say is some key aspects about Japanese architecture that we could become more engaged with or learn from?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I think there are a lot of texts out there, many of which I reviewed for my PhD, which basically engage with a very, very superficial understanding. And as a result, there's really a complete lack of engagement with everyday experiences of architecture on the ground. Not architecture in some kind of monumental way, which I think happens a lot. There's a focus on certain types of architecture. But there are a lot of really, really interesting practices which are happening, which exist, and it just takes a bit of effort to find them, but it's there. And so I think if you are interested in it, start with those. Don't just automatically go for these big famous names or certain kind of models, which I think are elevated over others, but actually, yeah, see what young firms are doing right now, because it's very interesting. Yeah, I don't know if that's a good answer, but that's what I would suggest.
Yeah, absolutely. Before I ask the next question, would anyone like to ask one? Will's got his hand up. Oh.
Helen, you go. You go first, please.
Just unmute myself. Hi, Cathryn. It's really nice. It's really great to hear about your research and to see it in the way it's sort of developed in many different ways. I just have a question, and it's a bit of a loaded one, I suppose, because I know you had, and I know because you mentioned it in your work, and I was suppose this like, and I'm also looking at it in my own research, this idea of outsider and how you sort of value your own interpretation within that. And I think you kind of looked at that, but I wonder if you would think of yourself as, because I've been looking at an idea of a sort of embodied outsider, how you can still have a relational, a very in-depth, deep relationship with a space or a set of people, but you're still you're still outside, and whether it's more like a reflective outsider, no, probably not. But then I was also thinking about the material interpretations, and that maybe that was a way that you'd arrived at critiquing those, falling into those traps of interpretation, and whether it's all going on a bit now, but whether you felt that they could then perhaps be developed into an architecture, or whether they are an architecture as well in themselves.
Yeah, I think in relation to the insider outsider, definitely. I think when I first started, I was in some ways quite engaged with the binary, and I was less thinking about that in between space. But when I actually arrived in Tokyo, and I was very much having those sensorial embodied experiences on the ground with people, it really shifted how I thought about the insider outsider, and I kind of described it as that I felt like a leaky container for insider knowledges. And in some ways it wasn't so simple as keeping this outsider identity intact, but more allowing those insider knowledges to challenge this outsider view through these different experiences. And that is where I did find writing on like feminist ethic of care, for example, very valuable to try and frame it within that kind of context. Yeah, that's what I'd say to that. I'm not, in terms of the critique aspect and whether, I like to say yes, they do have the potential to work in that way. But right now, I feel like I'm in a very different space right now. I'm in a very different environment. I don't engage with architects really anymore. So I think there's this necessary period of reflection that I need to have on the project, because I can't really decide how best to even make it public. I got quite conflicting views in my Fiverr around whether it should be a book or whether it should be an exhibition or whether it should be a journal article, a variety of different formats. And I'm trying to, make sure I actively reflect on those suggestions right now. So I feel like it could be, but I'm not sure right now how that would manifest. I hope that's some kind of answer to your question.
Well, were you next?
Mine is, it's not as good a question as I don't think Ruth's is probably better than mine. Ruth, do you want to unmute yourself, or shall we read out your question?
Hello. I mean, I can read it out if you want. I just wondered whether there were any other places to read about Asian architecture that you might have encountered in your research that aren't AJ or something? Because I spent a long time trying to learn Mandarin, and I'm going to say that's going to be a lost one.
Yeah, I think there is some. I mean, in the Japanese context, I can't speak to others, but I do actually think this is also the case in the Korean context, where there are these young kind of magazines which are trying to bridge more the connection, so they're often bilingual, and that can be quite a good source, because I found that Japanese architects were interested in them because they wanted their practice to be able to circulate in these alternative spaces. And then people who didn't speak Japanese were also interested in having conversations through this magazine format. So there are quite a few of those that are in existence. I can't speak to the Chinese context, though I'm not sure on that. But I would start by just trying to find these types of magazines. I mean, a very popular one would be Japan Architect, but even that's quite out there. There are smaller ones, small local publishing spaces which exist, and those are, I think, really kind of documenting more of architecture as a spatial practice as opposed to buildings as objects.
Yeah, are they available online as well? Or?
I think maybe some of them are, because in some ways I did like a historical analysis of how they've been represented in Japanese media and Anglophone media. There are some PhD theses. There's one in particular I can think of that came out of the University of Tokyo, where they did kind of a review of this kind of material. So that I could maybe email you if you want to put your email there. Yeah, and I'll go back through and find it for you.
Thank you, that's great.
Yeah, no problem.
Has anyone got any other questions before I ask my next? Toshi, you'd like to? Oh, sorry if I pronounced your name wrong.
Hi, yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you for the presentation. I have a couple of maybe reflection and a question as well. I think first the idea of transdisciplinary versus interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary. I think perhaps a good response to such differences would be to look at the root of a discipline itself. And I was wondering if you actually check the first kind of architectural texts and what they say about the discipline of architecture, because when you read Vitruvius at the beginning of the book, it says the difference between builder and an architect is that an architect must know the basic of other related subjects. And he names 16 subjects, including music, including arts, cosmology, philosophy, and others. And it says if you don't know the basic of this, you're a builder, you're not an architect. So if you put it this way, then I think the vocabularies of multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary would go away perhaps, because it's not needed. If that is what architecture is, and if you look at architects from Renaissance time, if you look at Alberti, Michelangelo, if you look at Guarini, two Renaissance masters, Guarini wrote 8 books on 8 different subjects. While he was doing architecture, he was teaching mathematics and philosophy, as well as architecture, 3 university, 3 subjects in the same time. So I think this was within the discipline itself, but it's a matter of perhaps losing that kind of ethos that was already placed and it already rooted throughout centuries and centuries. But more perhaps I wanted to talk about you mentioned about the gap, which I think is a very interesting idea. And you said that it's perhaps linked with the idea of a ma, or nothingness, in Japanese architecture, which you could find in the different kind of arts as well, like flowering arrangement or in the calligraphy. Always the absence or the void is always part of the game. But I think there, perhaps if you agree with me, there was a difference between the gap and ma, in a sense that gap that you were showing through your photography was the result of negligence rather than the ma, which was a deliberate attempt. And it was part of the composition. So deliberately the artist or the architect was trying to use absence or the void as part of the game, rather than it's a leftover, like those gaps that you were trying to show. And I think there's a big difference between these two. I don't know whether you agree or not.
Yeah, I completely agree. And in part, that was my kind of criticism of the architects I was interviewing, because they were speaking about the gap as if it exists in this kind of ideological way. And in reality, there was less of a conversation around how they actually use and how they've come to be. I mean, I wouldn't necessarily say neglected, because I do think they have very specific purposes, and those purposes shifted as to which neighborhood of the city you were in. So I think people have formed uses of them, which very much counter this idea that the architects seem to perpetuate, that they represent this way of thinking about Japanese space in particular. So in some ways, I didn't really want to create a work which mirrored that interpretation, but which rather spoke back to it and said, actually, this is what's happening on the ground with those spaces.
Yeah, thank you.
Sure. Thanks for your comment before. Thank you.
Cheers.
Unless anyone has any final questions, I'm just looking at the time. I think we might start to wrap up.
Sure.
Thank you all who have asked some questions today. I think it's great getting a range of voices and from different backgrounds in. And I think stemming from that last question about the word transdisciplinary, it is something that's involved and included in architecture, and especially at the way that Sheffield, we focus on a collaborative aspect to design. How can we sort of bring in these concepts of every day and use it into the very initial steps of design? So I think this has been a great sort of like supplementary discussion about the discourse. And thank you so much for coming in. It's definitely a lecture that I need to watch about 3 times through. There's just so much information there that I could slowly absorb with more time. So maybe we need to get a podcast version of this so I can listen to it go. But yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you. No, thanks a lot for having me. Thanks. Thank you.
And thank you, Denise, for organising.
Yeah, thanks, Denise.
Thanks, Denise. Thanks, Cathryn.
Thank you so much, guys. Cheers.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.